get onto this. I understand that it was circulated. So because it was circulated, I'm not going to go through every slide. And also, some of it is background that you already know about fragmentation, for example. So if in fact we just go forward one slide, all right, so I'm really going to focus on 4 and 5 because there's only so much time. There's too many slides here. Though let me say that this is the first iteration of this idea. But I'm due to present the paper. I didn't have the paper for it, I'm sorry, but it's in process. The paper will be delivered in Hong Kong in May, and then at the end of the week, that same paper then has to be delivered in Melbourne. So your comments and feedback will be very appreciated as I refine this paper further. I also want to say that, well, when I get to TPP, I'll talk about that. Okay, so if we go down, we can, apart from the lovely graphics that I put in,
They're very
start
nice.
From Earth, we go down small, we go out big. That's what I meant to say. So we can skip this one, and I'm assuming that you've all had it. Now, on the fragmentation of public international law, if you can go one more, or back one. This is sort of the understanding of fragmentation. And you would have gathered that I'm actually presenting a critique of fragmentation that is perhaps a little different than is typically provided. And indeed, typical to what I have presented in the past. At the University of Zurich last year, I was a keynote speaker from the European Institute, and I spoke about the role of legal culture and fragmentation. And I took it as assumed that we lived in a fragmented world with all of the negative consequences that are associated with fragmentation. But when I started looking at the TPP, because often when I talk of fragmentation, the example I'll use is from international economic law. We know how many RTAs and BITs, bilateral investment treaties, so it's the perfect example of fragmentation. But then when I looked at the TPP, I thought, really? This isn't so different. And it made me think, it made me reevaluate my views on fragmentation. And that's what's coming out in this paper. Now, I fully expect people to disagree, and I'm prepared to say that I may be wrong, or that my view may be colored by my particular perspective coming out of international law, which may be more coherent than some of the other fields of international law. Though I actually don't think so, as I'll get to at the end. I think it's a good example of what is actually consistent across public international law. So this, you all know this background, if we can go on the slide. And just for, I provided from the International Law Commission's report on fragmentation, a great document, really great work, telling us what's going on. And I have to say, even in that document, it wasn't so categorical that fragmentation was a great negative. Right? It's a good, nuanced document. But the common view, the conventional wisdom, is that fragmentation is generally a negative thing. It's not how we like our rule of law orders to be, right? So it does come through even in the International Law Commission's report on fragmentation that there is probably a strong inference that it's negative, and we need to think about how we're going to fix that. So a lot of work on fragmentation is about fixing it. Whereas as you can already tell, I'm going to say, no, let's take a pluralistic approach to this, as we do in domestic systems. It's actually fine, because we don't have that very significant differences at a conceptual level. And to me, that's an important thing. So we go down. So these are, if it's fragmented, some of the reasons for it. And I mirror this slide later on with the international economic law one. So you can see even at the field level of international law, we see a lot of the same causes of fragmentation. The growth of pluralism, globalization, there's particularly this lack of clear hierarchies. And indeed, in my Zurich lecture that I gave, my suggestions were to focus more on the hierarchies as a method to go forward, give them more substance, more strength, as a way to resolve a lot of the concern that we have with fragmentation. I had thought, oh, how original I was when I thought of this on my own. There's nothing new in the world. When I went on and checked, it turned out other people had talked about the second law of thermodynamics and fragmentation. Right? It was very upsetting. Thought, what a brilliant idea. I'm bringing my physics knowledge and maths knowledge. I'm not original. But I do think if you know about the second law of thermodynamics, it is an interesting way to think about fragmentation. Okay. And if you don't know about it, don't worry about it. So I'm not going to explain it. So the views, there's some positive views, some negative views of fragmentation. Remember, I'm assuming that you've had a chance to look at these. If you want me to stop and go slower at any slide, please, just shout out and I'll go through it in more detail. But I'm assuming you already had a chance to take it up. So if we go on, I particularly like this slide, right? Those of you in international economic law or knowledge, you'll know about the spaghetti bowl or the noodle bowl, right? Which is then graphically represented by all the bilateral investment treaties and RTAs. And this doesn't even do justice to them all, right? It's a total, one might say, nightmare. Except, I don't think so. We used to say, because of things like this, people who were involved in international trade on the ground would just say, I'm exporting, this is a nightmare. I'm just going to go for the WTO rates. I'm not going to go for the preferential rates that are out there. But with modern computing, it's actually not an issue. And it's the same when we get into rules of origin. With modern computing and processes that sophisticated companies have, it's actually not such a problem today. Right? There was good scholarship a while back. Brian Mercurio wrote a very good article in Asia in which there was some analysis of the way that people operate, and they just ignore the regional trade agreements because it was too complex. That's not true anymore. From my conversations with sophisticated exporters and sophisticated importers. But yeah, the noodle bowl in Asia and the spaghetti bowl in the West. Okay. All right, so international economic law, for some of you, maybe this was new. International economic law is, in some respects, the poster child of international law. It's got strict enforcement mechanisms, it's got that WTO appellate, it even has an appellate body, right? They've produced more opinions by a significant number in the 20 years that they've existed in the International Court of Justice has. And the record of compliance is significantly higher. Similarly, in the investment field, we see good compliance, good rule of law. So international economic law is very much a rule of law field within international law. That doesn't mean it's perfect. There's some significant issues. In fact, the existence of the TPP is a symptom of the problems that are in international economic law right now. The failure of multilateralism, as in global multilateralism. So it's a field in a little bit of crisis at the moment. And yet, if we look at just where it is right now, it's really very impressive. The other great fields of international law, there's been significant achievements in the Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, for example. Some of the other fields, it's slower, getting to good implementation, getting to good enforcement, getting to hard law, moving away from soft law. In fact, one of the examples of international economic law's sophistication is the lack of customary international law and international economic law. Right? It is heavily treaty-based, almost exclusively, or jurisprudentially based. Right? Customary international law, which you'll know, is just a very difficult form of law to work with, to prove, to find, to have legitimacy, right? Which is why the ILC is taking it, as much of it as it can, and producing conventions that everyone can join on. So this positive law that now replaces customary international law. We have almost no customary international law in international economic law. Almost none. And in fact, to the extent we have any, there are things like national treatment, most favored nation, they're non-discrimination ideas, but we don't need them because all the treaties have that in there. So it's just unnecessary to the extent it may exist. Okay. Is it fragmented? The usual view is yes, absolutely, terribly fragmented. That noodle bowl and so on. And it's not just that there's all these treaties, it's that every country implements this stuff. Right? So every country has their own statutes, codes, regulations, case law, their implementation. They have bilateral, multilateral It's just, it sounds like it should be an absolute nightmare, the perfect example of fragmentation. All right, and as you know, I'm going to argue that it's not. At least it should be called what I would say coherent fragmentation, because there's no question that we have all of this stuff. And it does make it a little bit awkward. I mean, how many RTAs is Mexico? Do you know offhand how many? It's a lot, right? I mean, now you're going to have to fit NAFTA and TPP. How's that going to work?
How many is it? Oh, what? How many free trade agreements does Mexico have?
We have around, we have like 14 agreements, but if you count the number of countries that are inside of those, there are like 46 agreements.
Each with their own rules of origin.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And with their own schedules of tariff concessions, and with their own schedules of if there's services, what services are applied, and often different implementation periods if they're developing countries. You know, it's complex.
Yes.
Right? So this is the standard approach, is that it is incredibly fragmented, and that's a problem. And every new RTA is viewed negatively by those that are worried about coherence and fragmentation in international economic law. So when the TPP shows up, the first mega FTA since the NAFTA, it's really very concerning to many people. Right? This is assuming it goes into effect. But I will take a different approach to that. Though as I'll know when we get to the TPP, it's actually quite hard to do that because it's so new. Right? There hasn't been a lot of analysis done yet. In fact, these conferences I'm going to will be some of the very first proper analyses of the TPP. Right? What are the causes? As I noted before, it's essentially the same. Though here I'm even noting the immaturity of international economic law and the failure of multilateral approaches. Well, that's one view, is that it's immature. I'm not sure that's merited. It's certainly not as mature as a domestic system, particularly in the strong rule of law domestic systems, but it's still pretty impressive. And my second law of fluid dynamics again. Okay. The feared consequences. The number one feared consequence, I would say, is the undermining of multilateral approach. You know, what is this going to do to the WTO? Is it going to erode support for, finally completing the Doha round? Though I think the Doha round is dead. Is it going to undermine the ability of limited resources that can be put into negotiation and implementation and so on at the WTO? Is it going to forestall? Is it going to set out, this is what we all think? WTO, you now have to adopt this, which isn't very multilateral. It's sort of forcing something on. So it's viewed as the enemy of the WTO, even though, if you look in the preamble, or the very first section, it acknowledges the supremacy of the WTO. It's created only pursuant to Article 24 of the GATT and Article 5 of the GATS. Right? It's subservient. Now, we would have hoped that actually meant something, but we know that the WTO routinely does not actually review FTAs, RTAs. It just it hasn't done so. The only time we've begun to see this is in a few cases, the India textiles case with Europe, where there was some suggestion of that. But otherwise, the WTO does not police RTAs the way that originally it was conceived of in 1947 when Article 24 was in the GATT, and then when the WTO came. Okay, next slide please. This is the TPP. We'll talk about the TPP now. It is significant, it's huge. Of course, the big missing piece, what's the big missing piece, do you think? Maybe we feel more in Australia. It's China. Yeah, the lack of China. Though having spent some time recently, of course, looking through the TPP, I'm not sure they actually will be able to join the TPP. Though if it's as fluffy in places as I suggest it is, maybe they could. But it's going to be hard to get everyone to accept them, given the things in there about digital freedom, regulation of state-owned enterprises, and so on. So I think that That's an issue. Some have suggested that this is really more about politics, geopolitics, than it is about trade. And that may be true. And my suspicion is if it gets through the Congress, the US Congress, it's because it will be pushing on the geopolitical side and not on the trade side, not on the actual content of it, because the content's a little bit, is controversial in so many parts, or nothing in so many parts. Next slide, please. All right, so the TPP, we can skip through this. I think that you'll have looked and you also know about the TPP at this point. Mexico, of course, being one of the participants. Okay, so what is in the TPP? Well, it includes things that look pretty strong. For example, it's got environmental language in there. Brad and I were talking about that, which looks like it's stronger than the environmental language in other FTAs that we've seen, including the NAFTA. But when you go through it, it's going to be really hard to enforce. All right? Even if you're upset with another country, the consultations you have to go through. Plus, there's a very interesting sort of clean hands. You can only bring an action if you yourself have a similar provision that you're asserting they're not enforcing, which is I think that's a novel, to me, introduction into international law, where equity in the common law sense is typically not so clear. I'm not talking about equitable delimitation and law of the sea, but historical common law equity principles. The labor, on the other hand, that's stronger, I think. There's some interesting language in there that may work out. The regulatory coherence is perhaps the weakest chapter I've ever seen in an FTA in my life. It's full of fluffy words, soft words, and is not subject to the dispute settlement understanding. So not everything in the TPP is subject to the dispute settlement understanding. Often there's specific carve-outs of sections. The big things that people were excited about was the state-owned enterprises. Well, if you look at it in detail, it's perhaps not as strong as we originally thought. First of all, state-owned enterprise is defined where it's more than 50% government-owned, or they appoint a majority of the board. Well, as you all know, you can control a company with way less than 50% and way less than control of the majority of the board. And indeed, recent work that I've been involved with Chinese SOEs suggests that it's very often not 50% owned by the Chinese government. So I'm not even sure about how much it's going to cover. And one of the major areas of SOEs that we were concerned about were Malaysia and Singapore, and you have to look, they've actually got carve-outs themselves from it. So it's unclear what effect the SOE is going to have, because it's not typically an issue for a lot of the other parties. What else were we excited about? Well, the anti-bribery is interesting, but all anti-bribery does, to actually put anti-bribery into a trade agreement is interesting. We don't typically see that. But all it's saying is, all of you have to join up with what's already out there. Either the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, the UN Convention, and so on. And you have to have best practices. You have to have systems set up. So it's not actually introducing at a conceptual level anything new into international economic law. So that's this other point that I have is, there's new stuff that's deeper, there's more stuff covered, but it's conceptually not new. If that's the case, even though we now have more international economic law, we haven't really contributed to the field at a conceptual level. And if that's the case, that leads to, if we go down, well, this is what it's just another RTA. It's a mega one, but new fields and disciplines, do they really add to the confusion? Is it all that new? Right, if we continue to the next. Is it all that new? And of course, here's that caveat. Like so many academics, right? Talking about something that may not actually happen, right? The other word, meaning of academic in English, irrelevant. Is this in fact irrelevant, all these conferences and everything, because there is significant concern about whether the TPP will come into existence. But that doesn't bother me, because even if it doesn't come into existence, the TPP is setting the ground floor. This is what we all think should be in modern RTAs. Right? So when the TTIP, the Europe-America one, is negotiated, it should have at least this sort of stuff, right? When the WTO moves forward, for there to be any advance, it should have these things. So it's actually a very important document. It's a statement of the lowest common denominator of all those TPP countries. This is what we are willing to accept and be bound by. So it's very important in that way. All right, so is it new? I don't know that it's new enough. And this is probably the cornerstone of my argument, is I don't think the TPP adds to conceptual fragmentation, to substantive fragmentation. Next slide. I like this phrase, much of a muchness. It's a very old English muchness. Shakespeare used it. It actually predates Shakespeare. I think it's much of a muchness. And in fact, it's not just TPP, it's almost all international economic law agreements. They all include these things. And they're fine, they're good things. And they may have wrinkles here and there, like the dispute settlement system in the TPP reflects the experience, the annoyance that America and Mexico and others had with the NAFTA, the failure to create a proper roster, to select people. It deals with those problems. In fact, the TPP can be viewed as a response to all the annoyances of the last 20 years of the WTO and the NAFTA. Right? What are the things that really annoyed us? Let's actually sort them out here. And they put it in. But these are things that are not conceptually new. They're just fixing things. And so I'm not terribly impressed. I think it's nice. It'll be a better agreement, but I don't think it's new. I like to think of these agreements as we think of software. So you've got, the early RTAs in the 1980s are trade agreement, IEL agreements 1.0, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreements 2.0, NAFTA 3.0, the WTO 4.0, and so on until we eventually get to what I've determined this one's 7.0. Okay? But it's still within the same thing. It's added things, it's fixed things, but it's still the same software that we're working with. And then, did I already say that? I think you went back. And then go down. Okay, so coherent, is this map good?
Yeah, it puts Australia on top.
Well, this is, I think it's accurate. We can go down. So, is our concern about fragmentation in general justified? If it's not justified in international economic law, is it justified in other parts of public international law and public international law as a whole? Is it, I think, an aesthetic issue? Is it how it looks? It's not nice and orderly, but it's just messy looking. But it's actually coherent. And then indeed, can coherence and fragmentation exist? Well, they do, because in our domestic law, we have it all the time. It's true that in the more orderly legal systems of the world, typically the continental legal systems, private law is orderly. You've sorted out the definitions across what we would call torts, delict, and contract, and it fits nicely, it's coherent. And so you may say, but in those systems, yes, we don't have fragmentation and we have coherence. Except that's only in private law. Labor law is going to be a whole different thing, right? And the same with in public law, yet again, particularly modern constitutionalism, right? And then the regulatory areas, administrative law. Administrative law is likely to employ different approaches. And yet, it's all within the one legal system, it works, and it's coherent in the sense that it fits the principles and concepts of that legal system. So I think the fact we live with it already in domestic systems. In the common law, no question we live with it, because that's a mess. But in the more orderly systems, even there, we have fragmentation, and yet we still have coherence. And I'd say in the common law world, we have massive fragmentation, right? But it's still coherent. And where it's not coherent, and it's noticed, it's fixed. Okay? So I define coherence and fragmentation. We can go on. And then my conclusion.
Can we go back to coherence for a second?
Yeah. So it's logical interconnection, overall sense of understandability, congruity, consistency. So my conclusion is that we need to, as the kids would say, chill a little bit about fragmentation. And if we accept that it's actually okay, maybe we need to then think about other concerns that we have with it and try and identify those areas where there is a coherence issue. Right? And I'm sure that some of you in the question will suggest areas where there's serious coherence issues, whether it might be human rights because of the strong normative natural law character to it in comparison with other parts of public international law, though I have an answer to that. But I think that if we focus on that rather than figuring out how to make it less fragmented, right, and accept this is actually a mature legal system. Mature legal systems are messy because reality is messy. All right, I'll end at that.
Okay.